Have you heard of the Green Book, an amazing part of Black history that kept African Americans safe during the Jim Crow era? A historian is here to tell you all about it, plus a good excuse to shop the Saturday after Thanksgiving. We'll tell you what Bronzeville has planned for Small Business Saturday.
When Faraz, my son, was an infant, I just was struggling to find things that aligned with our style and sensibility.
We'll introduce you to a family who decided to meet their own needs and built a business out of it.
There's no sun up in the sky, stormy weather.
And a sneak peek at a special show honoring the legendary Lena Horne and Ella Fitzgerald. That's all ahead on today's People to People. Welcome to People. I'm your host, Micah Matera. Let's get started. Last month, the NAACP issued a warning about African American passengers, telling them to be careful flying American Airlines. The organization cited what it calls a disturbing pattern of racial bias. The warning was only its second in its 108-year history. It said Black passengers have been forced to give up their seats or removed from planes. In one instance, an African American was removed from the plane after responding to comments from two unruly white passengers. Well, 1936 to 1966, Black motorists relied on the Negro Motorist Traveler's Green Book. That's right. The guidebook was printed annually for African-American road trippers. While Black people bought cars to escape discrimination on public transportation during the Jim Crow era, they often faced more troubles like refusal of roadside assistance and arbitrary arrest. Well, today, we're talking to Professor of African-American History and President of the Chicago branch of Association for the Study of African-American Life and History, Lionel Kimble, about the book, why it was important, and why you think it resonates today, right?
Yeah, I think, very much so. I think, when we think about travel, right, I think you mentioned it before, the automobile made it a lot easier for Black folks to travel across the country. That coupled with the Great Migration, moving back and forth via train and automobile, we get into the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and I think travel is really on the mind of a lot of African Americans. But the problem is, as you move back and forth across the highways, what are these safe spaces that you can go to? And I think we really take it for granted. Something as simple as going to the restroom, right, can be very difficult on the highways between places like Mississippi and Chicago.
Right, and it was very difficult. You had for coloreds only and places they could and could not go. In the dark of night, you didn't know who was lurking and who was out there.
Right.
This is the book. I recently saw it on Facebook. Yeah. And a lot of people are saying, with a lot of the climate going on right now, that we need another book like this. And this book would be helpful, or something similar to this book, because let's talk a little bit about what is in this book and who wrote this book.
All right. It was published. It started by this guy named Victor Green. Right, and Green was a mailman from New York City, and what he would do is that as he traveled, he realized that there was an immense need to have this directory of safe places for Black people to go to.
So restaurants, hotels. I think you may have like parks and things like that, just places, museums, things
drugstores,
places you can go, because Blacks weren't always welcome back then, and it was very blatant back then.
Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with an environment where we still have these things called sundown towns, and essentially sundown towns are places where Black people shouldn't be in when the sun goes down. Don't let the sun hit you and you're still in this town, because it can be very dangerous for you. So we couldn't really stop at a lot of rest locations, a lot of towns to get a cheeseburger, to use the restroom or get gas. So we needed things like this as we traveled throughout the country.
And this lasted, you said 33?
36 to 66.
But it wasn't in print after 66. Why?
Well, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 basically made discrimination like the type they were experiencing illegal. So the belief was that, but since there were some federal protections on Black motorist rights and Black travelers' rights, this book wasn't all necessary, because there was some recourse. They can go to the courts, they can call the police or whatever.
And we know from the civil rights movement, a lot of the people who are older know a lot more past then, but younger people know the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King coming in, the sit-ins and things like that. So it was supposed to be over after 64.
Yeah, one would think. You know, but I think what we really see now, especially with the advent of social media, we see that these incidents of discrimination are still very prevalent in our community.
Well, we've seen it the last couple of weeks with the white supremacists, you know, in Charlottesville and things like that. You know, they're having these protests openly, and it's being condoned by a lot of folks.
Yeah, I think our current political climate, I think a lot of the so-called alt-right, white nationalists, whatever you want to call them, they've been emboldened now because I think there's this belief that there are no recourse for doing some of these things. You know, and I think it's hard to argue against that. I mean, if we look critically, you know, we can say, well, there's no repercussions for these marches and these protests and these blatant acts of discrimination.
What would the Green Book of today look like?
Well, that's a good question. I think we're still dealing with some of these, right? Look at people like Sandra Bland, who was driving down to Texas.
Right.
It's still fairly dangerous to drive on the highways.
She was arrested because I think a blinker was out or something like that.
So,
and they said she hung herself, but there were a lot of questions around that.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions about that. So I think there's still some need to have warnings on where we can expect to have adequate police protection, where are the highways that are not safe for us, where are the towns that are not safe.
Or as you hear, the driving black.
Driving while black,
yeah.
And to some degree, this book was a direct result of driving while black.
Right. So nowadays, the modern day would be a little bit different, like what happens if you're stopped by a police officer, for instance, and things like that. Should someone come up with a book like that? I
think so. I think, you know, as a historian, I think historians deal with continuity and change, right? We talk a lot about change, but really what can we learn from the past and apply some of these same mechanisms and ideas and institutions, organizations to the present?
It is so interesting to look at it, and you said you got yours on Amazon.
I found three different years on Amazon. It's like $25 for the three of them.
And you had an uncle who lived in St. Louis, and he knew all about this book.
Yeah, it's funny because if we think about, we learn a lot of stories from our elders, and I was recount this story all the time when we were travel across country. My uncle was very adamant about leaving 3, 4 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And particularly because he said we don't want to be stuck in places like southern Indiana or rural parts of Kentucky at night.
My dad always wanted to drive real early in the morning.
Yeah.
I'm like, why at 3 and 4 in the morning?
Yeah.
Maybe that was why.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. The Green Book. You can get it on Amazon. Thanks, Lionel. A great resource if you're interested in this topic. And others is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History at asalh.org. Still ahead, a look at special shopping event the day after Black Friday.